Tomorrow is a most important date, 24th October. 350 years ago tomorrow was the end of the catastrophic 30 Years' War that devastated Europe and that brought the modern state system into being. Tomorrow, 75 years ago, in San Francisco, the United Nations Charter was adopted. It is not well known that at the same time, tomorrow, 75 years ago, you see if I could share this slide. Oh, maybe I can't. Okay, share it. The United Nations building was, the foundation stone was laid in New York for this most majestic building. And to understand the United Nations, the historical context is quite important. The term United Nations was coined by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in his 1942 New Year's Declaration of the United Nations described the World War II alliance of initially 26 states against the Axis powers, Germany, my country, Italy, Japan, plus Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Yugoslavia. Secondly, the United Nations emerged as a utopian project out of two catastrophes in the 20th century, namely two world wars. In the 1920s and 30s, the opportunity was missed to organize peace. Japan invaded Manchuria, Italy invaded Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia today, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, started World War II, and carried out the genocide against the Jews. After that catastrophe, a new chapter in world history was to begin. The idealistic vision was breathtaking, namely that states would cooperate regardless how big, how powerful, how rich, or the opposite they were. President Roosevelt emphasized that the United Nations heralded the end of unilateral, of military alliances, spheres of influence, and other instruments that had existed for centuries. The United Nations Charter was ratified by the US Senate by an overwhelming vote of 89-2. It would not be today, and it would be virtually impossible to convince the 193 countries of the world, up from 51 in 1945, to draft again a charter for the security of the earth. The sheer numbers of countries, their different capacities, economies, interests would not allow it. And like ever before in human history, the victors did not seek revenge and thus did not plant the seeds for the next war. So one cannot emphasize too much the core principle of the UN, which is cooperation. Now, the United Nations was instrumental in the 1980s in formulating the dangers of climate change. In 1988, the UN General Assembly passed the first resolution on the dangers of climate change. The times were different. You might not know, but maybe you do know, that in here it is, that the Time magazine proclaimed 1988 the planet of the year, namely endangered Earth. That is what we were talking about 30 years ago. Now times have moved on. In Paris, the United Nations brokered an agreement which was path-breaking, for the first time bringing nearly 190 countries together to stop the dangers of climate change. Now, the bad news is that not a single industrialized country is on target to meeting its commitments under the Paris Agreement. The US has announced its withdrawal, and it will be effective actually the day after the election, namely on Wednesday, the 4th of November. Russia is ignoring, if not sabotaging, the Paris Agreement. China, interestingly, President Xi Jinping 4 weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, no less, announced that China aims to reach peak carbon emission before 2030 and will be carbon neutral by 2060. This is amazing in its scope. Of course, we do not know whether this is a serious commitment or it was a geopolitical maneuver to upstage the American president. And there are many open questions about China, but the announcement is already very powerful. The UN cannot enforce its resolutions. The UN can negotiate and it can normatively establish principles, but it cannot enforce them. So what we can hope for is that the United Nations now will do what its leaders 3 weeks ago announced, namely that there is no other globalization organization with the legitimacy, convening power, and normative impact of the United Nations. They concluded that multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity as we build back better for a more equal, more resilient, and more sustainable world. Climate change, the largest public policy challenge the world has ever faced, is at heart a human rights issue because our generation determines the life of future generations, of other species, and of nature. Humanity's future depends on the leaders of the world grasping their responsibility and working together, if not through the United Nations, then in its spirit, which is cooperation, compromise, and justice for all. Human rights, it's worth the fight. Thank you.